Voice of Geekdom is now on Patreon. If you've enjoyed this reader's guide, please consider checking out the link in the description to find out how you could help support the channel, and gain early access to audio narrations of all of my scripted videos, selected exclusive outtakes and bloopers from my recordings, and an invite to the Voice of Geekdom Discord server, where you can pose your Tolkien lore questions to me directly. Hello Tolkien geeks. Welcome back to Voice of Geekdom. This is my long-running playlist series on Tolkien's book, The Silmarillion. Last time, we read about Elu Thingol's interrogation of Finrod Felagund, king of Nargothrond, and his brothers Angrod and Aignor, accusing them of complicity in the murders of the Teleri of Alqualonde, the crimes of Fëanor and his sons. Angrod recoils from the false accusation, and angrily tells Thingol and Melian the truth of what happened at the kinslaying, explaining that they were guilty only of being persuaded to follow Fëanor in his rebellion. Thingol, king of Doriath, responds by saying that he will keep friendship with Finrod and the other children of Fëanor, and also with Fingolfin and his people, but closes his borders and declares that Quenya, the language of the Noldor, would no longer be permitted to be spoken within the lands of the Sindar. Chapter 16 expands the cast of characters in Turgon's hidden city of Gondolin, starting with Aredhel, the king's sister, the White Lady of the Noldor, who lived there as a member of her brother's court. First-time readers of a sensitive disposition should be aware that this story draws upon the darker side of fairy tale tradition, and does contain strong elements of spousal abuse. At the end of this first part of my Chapter 16 breakdown, I will be discussing issues of consent and sexual misconduct. Although Tolkien himself doesn't give us any particularly graphic details, the themes are there in the text. When the story begins, we are told that Fingolfin's daughter Aredhel had gradually become more and more weary of her lack of freedom in Gondolin, much as the Noldor as a society had wearied of their lives in Aman during the years of the trees. And she missed the company of her cousins, the sons of Fëanor, with whom she was extremely close during their time in Aman, before Fëanor's rebellion. Eventually she approaches King Turgon and asks his leave to depart the city. Turgon was loath to grant this and long denied her, but at the last he yielded, saying, "Go then, if you will, though it is against my wisdom, and I forebode that ill will come of it, both to you and to me. But you shall go only to seek Fingon, our brother, and those that I send with you shall return hither to Gondolin as swiftly as they may." But Aradel said,
"I am your sister and not your servant, and beyond your bounds I will go as seems good to me, and if you begrudge me an escort, then I will go alone."
Then Turgon answered, "I grudge you nothing that I have. Yet I desire that none shall dwell beyond my walls, who know the way hither. And if I trust you, my sister, others I trust less to guard on their tongues." The escorts that Turgon sends with his sister are not named in the Silmarillion, but it's interesting to learn that in Volume 11 of the History of Middle-earth series, The War of the Jewels, it is suggested that the three unnamed lords who were sent with Aredhel were at one point considered to be, firstly, Ecthelion, who was the leader of the House of the Fountain in Gondolin, according to the early drafts of the stories that became the Silmarillion in the Book of Lost Tales. Ecthelion was accompanied by Glorfindel, whom readers of The Lord of the Rings will remember from the final chapter of Book 1, Flight to the Ford, and also by a third elf named Egelmoth. These first two will be important later on in the story, while the third, Egelmoth, was a legacy character who never made it into the 1977 Silmarillion. Ultimately, Tolkien seems to have changed his mind about naming Aradel's escort, deciding that it wouldn't benefit these three heroic characters to fail in their mission in this way. Turgon refers to his hesitation to let Aradel leave the city as a foreboding rather than a foretelling, and so he doesn't appear to be claiming any special insight here. But readers should of course be remembering Ulmo's warning to him from the beginning of the previous chapter throughout this tale, which is going to set up the events which will lead to the fall of Gondolin later on. Things start to go wrong when Aradel changed her plans midway through the journey. When she came to the ford of Brithiac in the river Sirion, she said to her companions,
"Turn now south and not north, for I will not ride to Hithlum. My heart desires rather to find the sons of Fëanor, my friends of old."
And since she could not be dissuaded, they turned south as she commanded, and sought admittance into Doriath. But the March Wardens denied them, for Thingol would suffer none of the Noldor to pass the girdle, save his kinsfolk of the house of Fingolfin, and least of all those that were friends of the sons of Fëanor. We read about the friction between the Sindar and the Noldor in the previous chapter, and we know about Thingol's judgment in the scene following Angrod's confession. And this anger has not subsided much in the years that have passed since then. Evidently, Aredhel is upfront about her intentions with the March Wardens of Doriath, and they turn her aside. It is possible, being sheltered within the realm of Gondolin, that she had not realised the extent of the feud between the Noldor and the elves of Doriath. Nonetheless, the guards advise her of the fastest route to find Celegorm and Curufin, who we know reside in the realm of Himlad in the northeast. Despite the fact that she is forewarned by the Sindar of the dangers of that road, Aredhel pushes on, still accompanied by her escorts from Gondolin, and she attempts to pass through the valleys of Ered Gorgoroth as they enter Nan Dungortheb. The last time we heard about Nan Dungortheb, aside from its description in chapter 14 of Beleriand and its realms, was when we read about the final resting place of Ungoliant, the giant spider who devoured the trees of Valinor. If you recall, we don't know for certain precisely what happened to Ungoliant, but her brood is still alive and active in the Valley of Dreadful Death, and Aradel and her escort are soon under their attack. Then Aradel turned back and sought the dangerous road between the haunted valleys of Ered Gorgoroth and the north fences of Doriath, and as they drew near to the evil region of Nan Dungortheb, the riders became enmeshed in shadows, and Aradel strayed from her companions and was lost. They sought long for her in vain, fearing that she had been ensnared or had drunk from the poisoned streams of that land. But the fell creatures of Ungoliant that dwelt in the ravines were aroused and pursued them, and they hardly escaped with their lives. When at last they returned and their tale was told, there was great sorrow in Gondolin, and Turgon sat long alone, enduring grief and anger in silence. But Aradel, having sought in vain for her companions, rode on, for she was fearless and hardy of heart, as were all the children of Finwë, and she held on her way, and crossing Esgalduin and Aros, came to the land of Himlad, between Aros and Kelon, where Celegorm and Curufin dwelt in those days, before the breaking of the siege of Angband. One cannot help but think here of Shelob from The Lord of the Rings, the text of which tells us that she was the last child of Ungoliant to trouble the unhappy world. We can't know for certain if Shelob herself was involved in the attack on Aredhel and her companions, but we can certainly imagine countless of her monstrous sisters lurking in the crevices of that horrifying valley. Aradel and her companions are enmeshed in shadows, the narrative tells us, and they are lost to one another in the darkness when they enter. It seems clear that the offspring of Ungoliant have a similar, though lesser, power to her own ability to create unlight, which we learnt about in Chapter 8. As a point of interest, in the chapter Shelob's Lair, the penultimate chapter to Book 4 of The Lord of the Rings, reference is made to Shelob weaving webs of shadow, and we are told there that her vomit is darkness, which certainly sounds very much like a nod to the infamous power of her famous mother. And so, although her companions were lost to her, Aredhel journeys on alone, and she reaches Himlad. But Celegorm and Curufin are not at home, and so she lives there for a while amongst Celegorm's people, enjoying her freedom and exploring the woodlands there in their lands. We were told here that the brothers Celegorm and Curufin were visiting in Thargelion with Caranthir, whom you may remember was the son of Fëanor, who had previously had that verbal confrontation with Angrod, son of Finarfin, in Chapter 13, and who was noted as profiting from his cooperation with the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. Celegorm and Curufin are two of the sons of Fëanor whom we have yet to be properly introduced to, but we will meet one of them later on in this story, and they'll show up as antagonists in the story of Beren and Luthien as well, later on in the book. Like Caranthir, these two are deeply unpleasant and morally compromised characters, with a chip on their shoulders about pretty much everything. They look down upon the Sindar and all other outsiders. They treat many of their other cousins amongst the Noldor with disrespect, and they are jealously obsessed with fulfilling the destructive oath of their father. The narrative doesn't explain why Aredhel doesn't travel directly onward to Thargelion to try to find them, or even why she doesn't head further north to try to locate Maedhros and Maglor instead. But it might suggest that perhaps the journey and the freedom that it gives her was more important than her stated goal of spending time with her cousins. Her desire to leave Gondolin behind for a chance to explore the wide world and to have her independence is similar to the impulse that Morgoth used to tempt the Noldor to leave Aman in the first place. That's not to say that this is a bad or evil impulse, but it is very Noldor of her to feel this way. Perhaps growing restless once again, Aredhel ranges further and further from her dwelling in Himlad, and one day while exploring, she enters the forest valley of Nan Elmoth, the very same valley where Thingol and Melian had had their fateful first meeting in Chapter 4, when they were frozen in place there, immobilized, while the trees grew up around them, and the stars wheeled overhead. In that wood in ages past, Melian walked in the twilight of Middle-earth, when the trees were young, and enchantment lay upon it still. But now the trees of Nan Elmoth were the tallest and darkest in all Beleriand, and there the sun never came. And there Eöl dwelt, who was named the Dark Elf. Of old he was the kin of Thingol, but he was restless and ill at ease in Doriath, and when the girdle of Melian was set about the forest of Region, where he dwelt, he fled thence to Nan Elmoth. There he lived in deep shadow, loving the night and the twilight under the stars. He shunned the Noldor, holding them to blame for the return of Morgoth, to trouble the quiet of Beleriand. But for the dwarves he had more liking than any other of the elven folk of old. From him the dwarves learned much of what passed in the lands of the Eldar. The Dark Elf moniker by which Aedhel was known was usually a simple term used for the elves who had never seen the light of the trees. This was how Chapter 5 explained the term, as part of the breakdown of the various groups of elves, and this is also shown in the diagram at the back of the book. In Quenya, the Calaquendi were the elves of light, and Moriquendi, elves of darkness. Aedhel's designation as not just a dark elf, but as the dark elf, is a very notable piece of nomenclature, and suggests a slightly different usage of the term as a pejorative, outside of its usage as a literal taxonomical term. You may recall that Caranthir had also used Dark Elf back in Chapter 13 to describe Thingol himself, which isn't even technically correct, since Thingol did see the trees when he journeyed to Aman with Finwë and Ingwë as one of the 3 envoys of the Eldar sent from Cuivienen. Aedhel's vocation was a weaponsmith, and he was famed among the Sindar for his discovery of the metal that he called Galvorn, which means shining black in Sindarin. He built armour from his Galvorn, which he often dressed himself in when abroad in Beleriand, or on one of his visits to the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. But we will later learn, in Chapter 21, that his greatest achievements were the swords Anglakel and Anguirel, the former of which was given over to his kinsman Thingol as payment for living there in Nan Elmoth, and will play a pivotal role in the story of Turin Turambar. It came to pass that he saw Aradel Arfaniel as she strayed among the tall trees near the borders of Nan Elmoth, a gleam of white in the dim land. Very fair she seemed to him, and he desired her, and he set his enchantments about her so that she could not find the ways out, but drew ever nearer to his dwelling in the depths of the wood. There were his smithy and his dim halls, and such servants as he had, silent and secret as their master. And when Aradel, weary with wandering, came at last to his doors, he revealed himself, and he welcomed her and led her into his house. And there she remained, for Aedhel took her to wife, and it was long ere any of her kin heard from her again. Aradel as a gleaming light in the darkened forest of Nan Elmoth, and an object of desire for Aedhel, the dark elf, who lives in darkness and shuns the light of the sun, it summons the recurrent imagery of light as an object of desire in the Silmarillion. Remember Morgoth's jealous coveting of the Silmarils as a motivating factor for his corruption of Fëanor and the Noldor, and later Ungoliant's lust to consume them. Aedhel's attraction to Aradel is another example of that same symbolic theme, and an indication of his inherent corruption. In many ways, I think this passage describing Aedhel's twisted pursuit and entrapment of Aradel is one of the most disturbing in the whole Silmarillion. We're going to stop reading here, but I do want to just peek ahead to the first sentence of the next paragraph of the chapter. And this is where, as I said at the beginning of the video, we touch on some quite sinister issues. The new paragraph begins with the following quite chilling sentence. It is not said that Aradel was wholly unwilling, nor that her life in Nan Elmoth was hateful to her for many years. Now this may perhaps seem innocuous enough at first glance, until we start to think more about what Tolkien is deliberately not saying here. Firstly, it is very interesting to note that in 1959, Tolkien wrote a different version of the Aedhel and Aradel story to what we read here in the Silmarillion, in which we can infer that Aradel was likely forcibly raped by Aedhel. In that draft, published in The War of the Jewels, Tolkien wrote that Aedhel took her to wife by force, a very wicked deed in the eyes of the Eldar. In the essay known as Laws and Customs Among the Eldar, also presumed to have been written in the late 1950s, we learn that elvish marriages are essentially initiated through the act of consummation. Marriage is chiefly of the body, for it is achieved through bodily union, and its first operation is the begetting of bodies of children, even though it endures beyond this and has other operations. Ergo, if Eöl forced Aredhel to marry him in this later draft, according to this information, it follows that he quite literally forced himself upon her physically. And yet, this contradicts another idea also found in the Laws and Customs essay, that acts of sexual violence are unheard of amongst the elves, and that an elf would reject bodily life entirely and pass to Mandos in such an event. Regardless, Christopher took the editorial decision to use an earlier version, which does not include either the explicit or implicit use of force, although there is certainly more than a hint of magical coercion involved, which is decidedly creepy to read.
Aredhel Arthaniel was voiced by a new friend of mine, Jennifer Gallagher of the Lord of the Rings Watch Party podcast. I recorded a guest appearance with Jen and her co-host Michael recently, and we had a ton of fun talking about Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring movie. You can find their links in the description below. Also, a huge thank you to my Axe tier patrons over on Patreon, Erin M, Stephen Stark, and Jaded Redhead. Once again, please check out the link in the description if you would like to hear your own name read out in future videos.
Next time we will be introduced to Maeglin, the son of Eöl and Aradel, and he and his mother will attempt to escape the clutches of the monstrous Dark Elf.